So you're really welcome. This is a Stop Climate Chaos Coalition webinar on the outlook for climate policy in 2022. It's been a remarkable year in 2021 on climate. We have seen the passing of the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Amendment Bill, which is a significant step forward from the first version of that in 2015. And as many of you in the audience will know, Stop Climate Chaos has been campaigning for a strong climate law since 2007. And while we still don't think this one's perfect, it is a significant step forward from 2015 and is a really robust climate policy framework by international standards. So it does pave the way for a far more evidence-based, transparent policymaking, we hope. Certainly, but it changes the rules of the game. And we've already begun to see that play out with the draft carbon budgets proposed by the Climate Change Advisory Council and the Climate Action Plan that came from the government this year, which at least as its aim is doubling the ambition of the previous one and aims to halve emissions in 9 years between now and 2030. So that's where we got to this year, but it was mostly still governance and laying the ground. And what lies ahead is, if anything, the far more challenging task of actually not just identifying, but implementing policies that reduce emissions and bringing people with us and making sure that the most vulnerable in our society are not unfairly disadvantaged or impacted by policies to reduce emissions. All, of course, in the context of the accelerating climate change we're seeing in the world and the mathematical truth that even with these targets, Ireland isn't doing its fair share to contain climate breakdown. So it's not, we always knew it was climate action, climate change was a wicked problem, and it hasn't got any easier, even if we've got more clear-eyed and more determined as a society about dealing with it. So we have assembled a panel of people to help us reflect on the year, but more importantly, to kind of look at the path ahead. What are the opportunities, but more probably what are the challenges and the speed bumps along the way, whether that is sort of in the energy system, in the political system, in the social system, in the agricultural system, in all the systems that need to change if we're going to do enough to prevent climate change running out of control and enough to leave no one behind. So that's the scene we're setting. The panel we have this evening, I will introduce them as we go along, but it is Dr. Hannah Daly from UCC, Dr. Cara Augustenborg from UCD, Dr. Kieran Murphy from the Jesuit Centre for Faith and Justice, and Pat Leahy, the political editor of the Irish Times. And I'm joined by my colleague Evelyn, who'll be making sure that the whole thing stays on the road from a technical perspective. And with that, the format for the webinar is pretty simple. We're going to let each speaker speak for about 8 minutes or so, and then there'll be 20-25 minutes for questions and answers from the floor. But you can get going in that now. There is a Q&A box and there's a chat box, so feel free to tell us where you are, tell us what your hopes for climate action are in 2022. You can put that in the chat box if you like, and it'll be really interesting to know where you are as someone who is engaged, obviously, and concerned about climate action. What do you hope for in 2022? But if you have questions you want any or all of the panel to answer, stick them in the Q&A box, and then others can upvote them, as they say, to see which ones are of most interest, and we will get around to them once everyone has been around once. But I will start with you, Hannah. So Dr. Hannah Daly is in UCC and is an energy, whenever I get this right, an energy modelling systems specialist, an energy systems modelling specialist perhaps, and was part of the Carbon Budget Committee that did the technical work and the advice to the Climate Action Council when they were producing their first carbon budgets, which are 5-year targets for emissions recently. So Hannah, we'll hand over to you to set the scene for what lies ahead.
Thanks, Oisin, and thanks to everyone who's attending for giving us your evening. I hope you find this instructive. So as Oisin said, it's been a really hugely momentous year for climate action in Ireland, and we have among the most ambitious 2030 targets in the world to, I suppose, compensate for we're slow to get off the mark. So we made a major landmark this year in terms of agreeing the Climate Act, getting that through, and also the Climate Council recommending their first set of carbon budgets. But we're not there yet. Even in terms of the carbon budgeting process, we're actually only towards the start of the process. The government still has to adopt the carbon budgets, and the really hard part, the really legally binding hard part, will be setting legally binding sectoral carbon ceilings, which will come over the next year. That's not even, in my mind, close to being finalized. So this is the part where every sector will fight for part of the carbon budget pie, and we're going to see, interest groups, we're going to see sectors fighting for as much of the carbon budget pie as possible. So I predict that next year will bring an awful lot of lobbying, and I suppose it's our role to show how every sector in opposite of that can go as quickly as possible. So it's a really critical time, because if one sector doesn't deliver, or if some of the critical parts of the elements are missing, it will make the carbon budgets unachievable, and it will be kind of a big disappointment. So what I want to do in my few minutes is, first of all, go through some of the key mitigation measures that are needed. We know what lies ahead in terms of what we need to do to decarbonize. I want to talk a little bit about what will happen if we don't meet those measures, and also talk about some of the cross-cutting issues that I see coming down the line. So first of all, as Oisín said, I work with a team of modelers, energy systems modelers, to look at very steep decarbonisation of the energy system to inform the policy process. It's a group effort at UCC, and we're very happy to have been part of the Climate Council's but carbon budgeting process. So the sort of the quantitative models that we built to chart, to map different pathways, many different pathways that can achieve the level of decarbonisation that's necessary. The first kind of positive news is that ambitious carbon budgets for the energy system are certainly achievable, and many studies, including ours, across different worlds, across different parts of the world, show that meeting net zero emissions or steep decarbonisation can be met with net societal benefits. So we often hearing about the cost, but there's many benefits that can be brought along with these measures, if they're done in a sensible way, in a way with planning and with proper insight. So I suppose, to take a step back, there are really, between now and 2030, there are really three ways that we can reduce emissions, and we need to take all of those from the energy system. Right now, I'll talk about the energy system, which is electricity, heat, transport, and industry, things like basically burning fossil fuels. First of all is to reduce our demands. So, for example, fewer trips with private cars, focusing on energy intensive sources like data centers. So reducing the overall size of the energy system is the cheapest, the easiest way of doing this. And we've charted a low energy demand scenario to show how that can be done. Second of all, energy efficiency, which is doing the same but with less energy. So that, for example, means retrofitting your house, having an industrial process that is met with much more efficiency. That is often seen as the first fuel and the best in terms of win-win solutions, but there's always dangers from energy efficiency that they bring rebound effects. Some of those rebound effects are good. It means warmer homes, but then you're actually using more energy. And the third then is replacing fossil fuels with renewables. So starting with the most carbon intensive fossil fuels, peat, then coal, then oil, then gas. These are the ones that we should be targeting, replacing those wherever possible. And it's important to note that the only kind of solution that we've deployed at scale here in Ireland domestically is wind, even though wind only accounts for about 6% of our primary energy supply. When you count all of the energy coming into our energy system, which includes heat and transport and industry, wind is only 6%. It's about 40% of our electricity now, which is amazing. But if we want to decarbonize heat and transport, it's really scaling those up. Bioenergy is about 3%. We import a lot of that. So the challenge will be to increase the share of wind, of renewables and bioenergy together to around 50% by 2030, a huge challenge. So moving, trying to kind of go through the sectors. Electricity is going to be a cornerstone of decarbonizing the rest of the energy system, heat and transport. And we might even see emissions rise this year because coal has been online. Getting the offshore wind industry off the ground as quickly as possible will be essential. And although increasing gas capacity is necessary for balancing and to replace coal and peat, at the same time, we need to use that gas capacity as little as possible, so that focus on demand reduction and innovations to 2030 will be really important. Transport, we need to get cars out of towns and cities. Big cars in towns need to lose their social license, and electrifying where possible as well. Buildings, we need to get coal and peat out of buildings, and then tackle oil. I think getting homes burning oil will be one of the most challenging tasks to 2030, and to get them to stop burning oil. As someone who heats her house with oil, I can see that that's going to be a very big challenge. But it's at the same time, it's really important to know that individuals, so people kind of making everyday decisions to drive a car or to heat their home, individual consumers are only responsible for about 1/4 of our emissions directly. The rest, 3/4, are it's from the public sector, from buildings and from agriculture. So we really need to focus on those blind spots that have actually less of an ambitious target. So I want to talk a little bit about what happens if we don't meet those critical targets in the energy system, if we don't capture the benefits, and if we don't decarbonize steeply by focusing on those three things: decreasing demand, increasing efficiency, and replacing fossil fuels with renewables. What's going to happen is that we're going to have to import zero carbon fuels. And the only way to do that at the moment is with bioenergy. So if we don't decarbonize heat transport and electricity quickly enough, we're going to have to import bioenergy from I don't know where to meet the climate targets, and or to have chaotic kind of unplanned culls in livestock numbers, with the taxpayer liable for picking up compensation for farmers. And this will be expensive, it will be chaotic, and it won't allow these benefits of doing things domestically, of bringing the benefits like, you know, low air pollution, you know, more livable cities and so on to accrue. So that is the danger. I want to talk in 1 or 2 minutes about cross-cutting actions as well. One of the crucial things for the next year is that the long-term plan, the 2050 plan, is agreed. Right now, we're missing a long-term plan. 2030 is just a staging post to 2050. And for example, in my opinion, the definition that we have of climate neutrality in the Climate Act is not really workable, and there's no common understanding of what climate neutrality means. There's an international kind of accepted a definition that it means not adding any additional warming to what we already have. But that is not consistent with the Paris Agreement because of our high share of agriculture emissions. This technical point I'm happy to get into later. A second kind of theme, cross-cutting theme, I think, which I personally hope to see is the role of schools and education. So schools are mentioned in 6 climate action plan actions across a range of chapters. Climate change will be a chronic problem, and sustainability will be a chronic problem that we'll have to deal with for generations. So fundamentally, bringing climate change into the curriculum is essential. And I would like to see climate change and broader sustainability concepts brought in as a core part of the curriculum across many levels. But also schools are almost a direct kind of cause of emissions as well. For example, travel to school is actually a big component of our transport emissions. About 1/5 of our personal transport emissions are from driving kids to school. So what we need to do is advocate for safer streets and for walking and cycling in schools, better school bus provision, and for schools to advocate for dedicated space for these things. Finally, I want to speak a little bit about the role of academics. Personally, I found, in my opinion, academics have a great responsibility in society to set out the facts clearly, openly, and transparently without kind of drama or hyperbole. So in an exchange on Twitter with Kevin Anderson, who's a famous climate scientist, he said, it's our not our role to spin a cheery yarn or to paint a picture of doom, but to inform an open debate. So there's, from the EPA survey that was published last week on climate and the public consciousness of this, the public has huge trust in the position of academics, and it's really important that we point out when, I suppose, interest groups misrepresent factors of climate change, that we use our voice to make sure that they lose their social license to kind of spin mistruths. So I would kind of put a call on academics as well as civil society to play that role. I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion. Hope I didn't go over my allocated time, and thanks very much.
Thanks, Anna. And you have done that last one unflinchingly this year and before, and I know, because I know as someone who engages in a bit of online debate, maybe not as much as you, but a bit of it, that I get, you know, 1/10 of the blowback that you get, and there's no doubt that there's a gender dimension to that, and I take my hat off to you and all the others who engage in that somewhat thankless task of debating people online. But what the truth telling that you do from a position of far more authority than someone like me is an essential component of public discourse. So again, thank you for that. Cara, I will.
Oh, Oisín, you're on mute.
I'll hand over to you. So most of you in the audience will know Cara. Cara is the Environmental Policy Fellow in UCD. She is a member of the Climate Change Advisory Council, and indeed a member of Michael Dee's Council of State. And for full disclosure, we should also chair of Friends of the Earth Ireland some years ago, and Friends of the Earth Europe for a time. And we still rely on her insight and analysis a lot, both publicly and whenever she'll talk to us otherwise, when she's not too busy with the French former foreign minister and everyone else that she was talking about online in the last week. So Cara, what's your take on where we are and where we're going next?
Thanks, Oisín. It's always good to be among friends, especially as we approach the Christmas season. So thanks for inviting me. And I just second what Hannah said about, you know, the need for academics to put their voices out there more and kind of dispel a lot of the myths, because I think we're approaching kind of a scary time, but also it's a really exciting time when it comes to climate action. And when we saw in the last election, we saw this kind of green wave where voters were raising the issue of climate change on the doors for politicians from every political party. And I think that was a great moment for those of us who have worked on climate communication over the last decade. It was something we asked people to do, to raise that issue at the doors with every politician, and it finally happened. And I suppose that the fear was that with COVID and all the things that we've been dealing with since then, that climate might fall off that agenda. And I think the really hopeful thing about the survey that Hannah mentioned, the EPA Yale Climate Communications Survey of the Irish public on climate change, is that most people that were surveyed are still very concerned about climate change. They think it should be a priority. They're willing to, you know, take steps and actions, which a lot of people say, oh, people are concerned, but actually they're not willing to do anything about it. I think that survey really showed that people are prepared to do something about it. They're prepared to pay for carbon pollution, and they think, you know, more needs to be done. So it looks like we still have the same kind of green wave attitudes prevailing in spite of the pandemic, maybe even more so. And that's a really good thing. And then at the same time, we've had this exciting moment where we finally have carbon budgets, and these kind of 5-yearly carbon budgets are really important because we have had climate legislation in the past. Our first climate low carbon development act was passed in, I think, 2015 or 16. But the problem with that is that it didn't actually bend that emissions curve down, because it really didn't have the teeth to drive emissions reductions in the different sectors, because every sector kind of said, look, it's not our problem to reduce these emissions. So now we have these carbon budgets, and the government will hopefully approve the budgets that were recommended by the Climate Advisory Council a couple months ago, thanks to Hannah and her team's great analysis. And then the challenge will be over the next few months is setting those sectoral emission ceiling and kind of slicing that pollution pie among the different sectors. And Hannah's absolutely right that the big worry is going to be that all the vested interests and all the sectors are going to start heavy lobbying. And we as civil society have to really shout loudly and clearly that we still want action, and we want 1.5 to, you know, to stay alive and all of these things, to try and fight against what's going to be a very difficult fight in a number of sectors. So I think it's a concern, but it's also a moment where we could see great change coming down the pipeline. So those are the two things going on nationally, I think, in the next few months that we all need to keep a very watchful eye on and stay very engaged in. But interestingly, I was in France all last week, so I have a lot of French stuff on the brain right now. And I had a chance, the Ministry for European and Foreign Affairs in France selects 75 people from around the world every year to go to France and learn about anything they want. So this last week, I was learning about climate policy and agricultural policy in France. And so I had a chance to meet Laurent Fabius, who is the president of COP21 in Paris, the man who struck the final gavel on the Paris Climate Agreement, and had a really interesting discussion with him about international climate policy and what's happening internationally. And I would say I came away from that feeling that while we're showing great strides here in Ireland in terms of our level of ambition to take action on climate, we also need to be really mindful about what's going on internationally. And it isn't such a great news story internationally. If you were following the last COP, there were a number of countries that really lowered their ambition. You may have seen Mary Robinson getting very upset about what was happening at the COP. And now the next COP, COP27, will be held in Egypt. And one of the things Laurent Fabius said to me is that in Glasgow, civil society was really the driver of pushing ambition in the negotiations, because there were so many representatives from civil society around the COP and really driving increased ambition. But of course, in Egypt, that won't be the case, because it'll just be a much more closed environment, and there won't be the opportunities for civil society to engage. So one of the pieces of advice that he gave me, which I thought was very interesting, is that until the start of COP27, the UK government is still the secretariat or overseeing the COP process. And that means it's the UK government that sets the agenda for the next COP. And Laurent Fabius's advice was that actually the agenda setting is probably the most important piece. And the problem with the last COP is that the agenda was spread too thin, and so very little could get done. But actually, if we as civil society could put pressure on the UK government to set a more focused agenda, there's a potential to actually get more done at the next COP before it gets handed over to Egypt, who will run the process for the following year. So I think we should keep in mind some of these international things. I know, Oisín, you posted the recent news that Russia vetoed the UN proposal for climate action that Ireland had put forward this week. And, so I think there's signs that we still have a big fight internationally to get the kind of climate action we need to stay below 1.5 degrees. So we can't just focus on the national agenda, but we also have to look globally too.
Great, thanks, Cara. That was bang on time, and but still plenty of food for thought. Our next speaker is Dr. Cara Murphy from the Jesuit Centre for Faith and Justice, who is also a member of the steering committee of the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition. And I was really keen for her to speak today, because one of the things that's changed, of the many things that's changed over the last 10 years, is that as a coalition, Stop Climate Chaos, and certainly here in Friends of the Earth, but as a coalition, we're far more aware of the need to take into account the impacts, not just of climate change, which we definitely do, but of climate action. And the need to make social proof and to look at the intersections of climate action and the other crises we face. There's already a question about the housing crisis in the questions and answers. And when we started Stop Climate Chaos 14 years ago, we were grateful if we got the 16-second soundbite on the news every so often, and we hit the top line about the need to cut emissions. But as we and others and the world has carved out more space for climate change discussion and policy, it's all the more important in the context of trying to bring everybody with us and leave no one behind, so to speak, that we look more deeply, and we use our platform to look at where this cause of faster and fair climate action intersects with other causes, and make sure that we don't make other things worse while trying to address climate change. So the Jesuit Centre has done a lot of work on this, and a lot of work on the idea of, for example, of a Green New Deal. So we were really keen to hear what they, and Ciara in particular, thinks of the climate action plan that was announced this year, and what are the challenges ahead as we go into 2022.
Great. Thanks a million, and thanks a million for having me on to the webinar. And again, thanks very much for attending, because it is late on a Monday, so I'm sure there's other things that people could be doing. There's a couple of things that I'd like to talk about in the couple of minutes that I have. But the first thing I'd like to go through is Oisín mentioned the importance of social justice, and I'd like to kind of stress just how vital it is, and it shouldn't be considered as a secondary nice to have for climate action, but it is a really important aspect, because if we think that if we want everyone to get involved in climate action and in the environmental movement, there is a certain floor that people need to have to be able to be active citizens, I suppose. So like that floor should be like we're thinking in terms of housing and poverty, kind of the support. So if you kind of consider, if you've someone who doesn't know where they're going to sleep the next night, or how they're going to pay the next month's rent, or where they're going to get their food for the next meal, really that person can't be expected or won't be able to be actively involved in the climate movement or actively involved in climate action. So it is that floor that people kind of need to stand on to be active citizens in this. So that's something that I'd just like to get across, because it's not necessarily climate action, but it is something that's that our work kind of focuses on a good bit. So with that in mind, just kind of like keeping an eye on the housing policy and even the refugee policies and all that sort of stuff is an important aspect of this. So within this talk, there's a couple of things I'd just like to focus on, and I'm just going to go quickly through what our fair share is. And then I'm going to specifically focus on housing, because that's what JCFJ do quite a bit of, and just look at the just transition and the implementation. So I'm focusing mainly on the climate action plan, as Oisín mentioned. So I'll just quickly go through it. So we're, in terms of a fair share, we're not doing it, basically. I think this was mentioned before. So in terms of lowering our emissions, or in terms of climate finance. So as it was mentioned, Ireland has the new legislation reduce our emissions by 51% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. And that's basically in line with the EU. But the Climate Action Tracker, which kind of publishes independent scientific analysis, has said that the EU is insufficient in terms of its ambition, and that our actual ambition should be close to zero emissions by 2030. And that's when we do everything that we say we're going to do. So that's our full ambition, and it's still not in line. So if we miss our ambition, then we're going to be further back again. And in terms of climate finance, Ireland has promised to double its contribution to climate finance to 225 million over the next 4 years. And last month, or a couple of weeks ago, Oxfam presented in front of the climate or the Committee on Foreign Affairs, and basically said that this is nowhere near what our fair share should be. So Ireland estimated should be contributing between 450 million and 500 million, which is like double approximately, or over double what we say we're going to do. So, and then it's really important about what the quality of this funding should be. Is it grants or is it loans? So as well as looking at our emissions, looking at our aid and our climate finance, and the type of climate finance is a really important part of it as well. Just moving on to housing. So within the climate action plan, there's lots of really good stuff in terms of supports and policies for retrofitting, and a lot of that stuff is coming down the line. However, a lot of the supports, there's not that much support in terms of the most vulnerable to transition into into decarbonized housing. So if you own your own home, you're entitled to get more support, which is great. But if you're renting, or if you're on housing support, then you don't have as much control or as much support to decarbonize your house and the energy that's associated with that. One thing that is coming up is that landlord, or the rental stock, will have to have a minimum BER, and that landlords will have to see that housing are up to a certain standard. But in the climate action plan, there's no explicit, I suppose, protection for tenants. So I suppose the guarantee that there should be a cap on rents when the houses are retrofitted, that's not explicitly said, or it's not explicit within the plan, which can actually be a major problem in terms of tenant security and housing security. Another thing that's not mentioned, and in fairness, I wouldn't really expect it to be mentioned within a climate action plan, is social housing and affordable renting. So these are things that aren't necessarily climate action, but if you increase good quality social housing and affordable rental accommodation, you're going to decrease energy poverty within the most vulnerable communities, as well as increase in housing security among this community, and reduce the reliance on housing support, such as HAP. So it's kind of this, I suppose, a cross-cutting theme as well. So it's like, because housing is such a current and such an important political topic at the minute, and can be considered nearly unfairly in competition, I suppose, with the attention with climate action. It is really important that you find solutions and that can deal with the two of them. Now, just to move on to just transition. So it's really good that there has been continued commitment within the climate action plan for just transition. And there's two chapters that mentions it specifically, one in general and one specifically on the Midlands. And it's really great that there's going to be a just transition commissioner position established. But implementation has been a problem. And one of the things that kind of keeps coming up is the delay in even the paperwork to get access to the EU funding of 84 million for just transition. And this comes up as an issue. And there's also been accusations of like insufficient engagement with communities within the Midlands over retrofitting of houses within that area. So there's been a lot of money directed towards the Midlands, but delivery on the projects is actually quite poor. And sometimes the substance behind the money figures is a bit lacking. But in fairness, there are been really good projects in terms of like bog restoration, which is good for biodiversity, good for public amenity and water quality and all that sort of stuff. So there has been some issues in that terms of area, but there is some good stuff happening. So now just looking at the implementation. So I think it was in the news a while ago that the implementation of the climate action plan has been flagged as an issue. So there has been delays in implementation. There's gaps. And so while this plan looks quite good on paper and there's some really good stuff there, it is the implementation that will be the proof of the pudding, I suppose. So I leave it there because I'm just past my 8 minutes. So I will again take any questions at the end. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Cara, and thanks for staying to time. And I know you touched on one question that's been raised in the chat about the challenges for renters, if not the total solution. And we might revisit that if we get a chance during the Q&A. And speaking of the Q&A, my colleague Evelyn's found the button that she's pressed so that you can. I didn't realize you weren't able, the audience wasn't able to see the questions that have been posted. So you can, I'm hoping, now see them and give a thumbs up for the ones that you would most like to be answered, because I don't think we're going to get through the 15 questions that have been put in so far. Anyway, our final speaker of the evening is Pat Leahy, who's the political editor of the Irish Times. And as campaigners, we deal in the world as we think it should be. Political correspondents tend to deal with the world as it is, and sometimes that doesn't mean, that means we don't like what we hear. But in putting together this webinar, I thought at least, it was very important that we have a sense of the world as it is. And in my experience, there's nobody better to know where, for example, the backbenchers of Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, and indeed Sinn Fein are at, never mind them, as well as the ministers. And if we're going to navigate the path ahead, we need to be able to read the landscape. And we thought, Pat, it would be really interesting to hear from you on how you see climate action in the wider political landscape now.
Thanks, Oisin. Delighted to be here tonight. Thanks to you for the invitation, and to the several doctors that we've already heard from. I'm the only one on the panel tonight who's not a doctor. I feel like the janitor in ER. But anyway, I will. What I thought I'd do is just try and give you an overview of where I think climate action, the politics of climate action is at the moment within government, and then just maybe look ahead to next year as per the title of this evening's symposium. So I think the politics of climate action are largely indistinguishable, not just in Ireland, but in many places in Europe, from the political fate of green parties in various EU states. And we've seen the rise of green parties to the extent where we see recently joining the government or forming coalition government in Germany. But we've seen the gradual rise of green parties long before now, particularly in Germany, but also many other European countries, and not just at national level, but also at local and regional level. Ireland has been a bit behind that, not just because of the idiosyncratic structure of our political system and the unusual shape of our political landscape that I guess we don't need to digress into here at the moment, but also I think because other parties have been good at stealing the rhetorical close of, if not the actual policy close, then certainly the rhetorical close of parties like the Green Party. And I guess that has acted as sort of a brake on the expected rise of Green parties that you would expect to see in Ireland as our politics gradually over the last 20-25 years becomes more normally European, albeit with local flavors. But the Green Party's position in government now, it seems to me, is it's a triumph of political management for the leadership of the party. They played the politics of coalition formation very skillfully. They have brought that political skill, I think, to bear on their operations within government, and they are probably the most solid and settled part of the government at the moment. If you look at the opinion polls, you know, they're trundling around. They dropped a couple of points in opinion poll we had last week, but you look at them over, you know, important thing is not so much to look at party fortunes in opinion polls from month to month, but look at where they are over the medium term. And broadly speaking, the Greens have retained the levels of support that they won at the last general election. And that's because I think they're appealing to a niche of voters, which is considerably larger than the niche they previously appealed to, but still in the greater scheme of things, a niche. And they are doing things within government that find the approval of those people who believe those things are the most important reason when choosing who to vote for. And they've done that, I think, by being ruthlessly focused on their core objectives in government, just as they were in the negotiation of the programme for government, just as they were in the achievement of the climate legislation and in the finalisation of the action plan, none of which was easy, and in all of which processes they didn't get everything that they wanted, but they got enough to make it worthwhile for them to continue operating in government. I think they played those political cards quite skillfully. But as Oisín averred to earlier on, that was the easy bit. And it probably doesn't feel like that if you're in Green Party in government now, but the future is going to be even harder for them as we come to, as Dr. Cara mentioned, as we come to the implementation bit of the climate measures. So, and this is, I suppose, what I really want to talk about. Let's look at the prospects for success from a Green Party point of view when it comes to the implementation of the climate action. And I suppose there's two planes in which you need to think of that. One is politically within government, and the second then is with the public. So to take the first of those cases, within government, I think the level and quality of political will at government level to implement the climate measures is pretty strong. I'm not sure whether the entirety of the Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil parties are as committed as you might like to the implementation of the climate measures. But the leadership of both those parties in its broadest sense is, I think, committed to honouring the agreements that they've made with the Green Party, with an important qualifier insofar as it is politically possible for them and not enormously politically damaging. And I think you will see the leaderships of those parties having some difficulties their backbenchers, and we've seen some of that this year, and I think we will see it escalating a bit in the forthcoming year. And so to deal briefly then with the public attitudes to climate action, some of you might have seen we did a poll about, and I'm just trying to call up the headline here. It's, I suppose, so it's a tale of two headlines from two different polls that we've done in recent months. And the first of them was back in October. Some of you may recall when the headline was "Poll shows high degree of public resistance to many potential climate action measures." And the second one was this morning when we say there is growing support for climate action amongst voters. Poll finds reasonable question, well, which is it? Actually, I think it's both. I don't think those polls, even though you could look at them as being contradictory, I don't think they are. I think you put them together and you have a fair summary of where people are on climate action. That is to say, they are committed to the general principle of climate action. They are convinced by the case for climate action in a broad majority of them, an overwhelming majority perhaps is, but they are suspicious of individual measures that may cause them financial cost and personal inconvenience. And, you know, it's not perhaps all that unusual to see that. We saw in a different context, we did some, as part of the same poll, we did some work on people's attitude to a united Ireland, which was that they were broadly committed to the general principle of it, but had a difficulty with some of what the specifics of it might mean. I'm running up against time, so I'll go very quickly through the last couple of points that I wanted to make about the political and policy making process, the sausage making, if you like, that is to come. And I think that will be fraught with difficulty for the government and for the supporters of climate action, such as yourselves. I think there is quite a difficult job ahead of the government in putting flesh on the bones of the plans as laid out, particularly when it comes to the sectoral budgets. And I think it was Cara mentioned that there will be very heavy lobbying. Of course there will. That's not illegitimate, I suppose, but I think what we need to ensure, and people in jobs like mine need to ensure, is that there is the maximum degree of transparency possible on that process that is going, because it is a characteristic across all aspects of government action of the Irish system that those who shout loudest are those with the best access to the corridors of power tend to have a better chance of getting what they want. And the final point I'll make about this, my apologies again for going a little bit over time, is that while the Irish system, as we have always known it, is very responsive to powerful interests, we've also seen in recent years how it has become responsive to civil society campaigns too. And you look back to the example of marriage equality, of the repeal campaign, when very significant external pressure put pressure on the political system to do things that it might otherwise have preferred not to do. But I think the important point about those civil society campaigns is they didn't operate independently of politics. They operated in partnership with politics and with specific politicians and parties that were allied to their case. And it has long been the way in the Irish political system that the way to that the way to achieve change within the political system is to convince small elements of it, be they parties or parts of parties, of your case and get them to push that agenda from within power. Anyway, that's all I'll say for now. I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Pat, and thanks all four of you. So there's a very rich smorgasbord of food for thought, just to mangle a few cliches there. We have 25 minutes left. As our panelists have said, they're willing to stay till 8:10, and I definitely underestimated. I should know better by now, the number of questions we get. because I see 36 currently. Thankfully, we found the button where I think most of you can see now, where you can express your preferences among the questions. And I'd urge the panelists to have a look, because I'm going to be coming back to you about the most popular ones. Pat, I'll be coming back to you about the question about Sinn Fein policies shortly. But I'll start, I think, with whoever wants to answer the question about fossil fuel subsidies, which are to many of us, including myself, sometimes a bit of a black box as to what do they mean. But it is the most popular. What's included, and how do we get rid of them? Because it is always an aspiration to reduce them. So I'm not sure if Cara or Hannah, or indeed Ciara, but if any of you would stick your hand up if you want to crack at that question that's top of the poll. Thanks, Hannah.
Sure. I'm not an expert in fossil fuel subsidies in Ireland, so most of our fossil fuel subsidies are sort of indirect subsidies. We're not literally paying to make fossil fuels cheaper, but we're not taxing many of the fossil fuels enough. For example, jet kerosene, agricultural diesel, and so on. A lot of the direct fossil fuel subsidies that we have are actually accounted for as how do you call it, the winter fuel allowance, so making heating affordable to people on social welfare and so on. So there is an action in the climate action plan. I see it on reviewing and phasing out transport related fossil fuel subsidies. So there's an acknowledgement of that in the climate action plan, and that should make diesel and kerosene even more expensive.
Do you want to come in on that question, or do you have anything to add to that? The other one I was wondering, would you like to have a go at, is the biodiversity question, but there's also one about the accountability process, which any of you are willing to answer.
Yeah, I mean, just quickly on, I think Hannah summarized the fossil fuel issue well, but we do have to look at jet fuel, I think, really. I took a ferry to France this week, and it was considerably more expensive than flying, and part of that is because jet fuel is just so cheap. So we have some lobbying or campaigning to do on that issue in particular. I think on biodiversity and the question about why the two aren't linked, I think more and more climate and biodiversity are linked. Starting with the fact that our new Climate Change Advisory Council has a large range of expertise, including someone from civil society with an expertise in water quality and biodiversity. So I think we are integrating that. And if you look at the reports coming out of the Climate Change Advisory Council, there is more of a focus on biodiversity than we had in the past, when it was a council largely dominated by economists. So I think we're getting that more, but we always have to be careful when we are implementing climate actions. We have to know what the biodiversity impacts of that are. And there's some great work coming out of Trinity. In particular, Professor Yvonne Buckley has presented to the council some kind of win-wins where we can do climate actions that also are double wins, for biodiversity. Things like, wind turbines in the offshore area that are floating are actually opportunities for marine protected areas. Certain types of trees that we plant can actually be beneficial to biodiversity too. So there are lots of areas that we can do both, and I think we will see more of that, but we always have to be careful. I didn't see the accountability questions, so maybe I'll just leave that for someone else to answer, because I haven't seen it yet.
Either for yourself or Hannah, or indeed, I don't want to answer it. It's basically a question about what do you think can be done to improve emphasis, accountability, transparency, etc., on implementation and tracking progress against the climate action plan. So obviously,
no, I did that one. Yeah, I can.
A lot of that's covered in the climate law, but we haven't seen it in action yet. So do either of you want to address that one?
Yeah, I will say, and I'm sure Hannah or Pat or Ciara will come in on that too. And it's. I mean, and I think there was another question about that, there's lots of representative bodies for farmers and industries, but there's no one for ordinary citizens. And I think those questions are combined, because actually Friends of the Earth and other NGOs are the platform for citizens to engage, and they are the kind of groups that are monitoring accountability. I think we need more accountability. And the Climate Change Advisory Council is a way of looking at accountability too. But I was involved in the first ever environmental report card on the government's keeping their promises on climate and environment this year with Friends of the Earth, and that work will continue every year, I hope, going forward. So we'll continue to monitor the government's progress in keeping their own commitments, and I think that work is really, really important going forward.
Do you want to summarize what the process as it's supposed to be under the law with regard to the accountability cycle going forward?
Yeah, and I'm not I can say this a lot, but I'm a generalist. I wouldn't be able to recount exactly the accountability processes, but they are built in. They were also built into the last climate action plan. For example, that the Climate Action Delivery Board would meet quarterly and so on. But for example, the Climate Council's annual review published, was it last week, showed that a lot of these simply weren't weren't implemented. So there's a very detailed sort of set of processes by which the carbon budgets are set and reviewed, and there's reviews and plans and so on. But if those processes aren't fulfilled, then I don't understand how we can how that can be sort of possible. If it's in law, that's like, surely that's the last mark. But I suppose that the key thing is the organizations like the Climate Council and civil society pointed out as loudly as possible when it's not when the government doesn't uphold its own commitments for accountability.
One thing I'd say about the really good report from the Climate Council last week is that it was about 2020, and in 2020 those processes of implementation were not statutory. They were put in place by the last government with the 2019 Climate Act to implement the 2019 Climate Action Plan, based on how they'd done the action for jobs with some of the same staff, Richard Bruton and Sharon Finnegan, but they weren't statutory. And then of course COVID hit, so I wouldn't give them a full pass, but I would understand it was a challenging time. They're now much more statutory. Both the delivery, the coordination process around delivery, and specifically the accountability process, where it's not just an annual speech to the Dáil which no one attends, but it is the cross-examination by the Joint Directors Committee of each minister who has a sectoral emission ceiling as part of the carbon budget, will have to come before the Joint Directors Committee in the same way as Secretary Generals have to come before the Public Accounts Committee on foot of the Controller and Auditor General's report. The idea is that on foot of the annual Climate Action Council's report, that ministers will get grilled by the Joint Directors Committee. But we know from that, like, some of that we know could have happened under the 2015 Act, and we discovered afterwards it was written to make it not possible but not necessary. It's more tightly written this time, but there still is a role for civil society, for the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition, for the Local One Future Groups, for the rest of us, to make sure that the law gets implemented fully. Because even when it's in law in Ireland, ultimately you can go to court, but like there's both a capacity problem, a bandwidth problem, a prioritization problem, and a political will problem on all issues in politics. And we need to make sure that there's enough pressure to make sure political will remains strong on these issues. Speaking of political will, I want to go to the second most popular question, which was around Sinn Féin's climate policies. What does the panel view on Sinn Féin's climate policies? Will they row in behind rural populist demand to cut carbon taxes, etc., or continue with current strategies? And that's from Saib O'Neill, who most of us know as a formerly worked at Stop Climate Chaos and as an academic who works on climate change. And it's a really interesting question given the Sinn Féin's lead in the opinion polls. And I'll give you one example recently that has been brought to our attention by grassroots campaigners in the north, who have found Sinn Féin less than responsive on the issue of fracking and petroleum licensing and gas, where they have power in the executive to stop other parties, i.e. the DUP, bringing forward a pro-fracking policy, but haven't been definitive about it, and indeed power to push for a more progressive policy, and have been slow compared to their vocal, consistent opposition to gas infrastructure in the south and fossil fuel infrastructure in the south, which we have, as campaigners, have welcomed. And so there'll be more of that, north-south comparison, and then obviously if they do, take part in the discussions on the next government, or potentially leaders will face these questions much more rigorously and unavoidably. And I know, Cara, you looked at their manifesto before the last election, but I will start with you, Pat, and the others can come in. Where do you think Sinn Féin sit now? Like on, well, I won't comment myself for now. Where do you see that debate internally, if there is one, or are they thinking about it yet? You're on mute.
Apologies. Yeah, to answer your question, are they spending much time on it? I don't get the sense that they're spending an awful lot of time thinking about it. My colleague Harry McGee has written quite perceptively on this. You'll get his articles on the on irishtimes.com. But my sense is that Sinn Féin pays lip service to climate action now, but it is not a core concern of the party. So I spoke earlier about the you know, the ruthless focus on their priorities that the Greens have exhibited in government. I just don't think climate action is a priority for Sinn Fein, and therefore they are not ruthlessly prioritizing it or focusing on it. There's also, Side makes the point, or she uses a description of the populist demand to cut carbon taxes, etc. And there is a strong populist element to Sinn Féin's campaigning at the moment. I mean, I use that as a description rather than as a judgment. And in fact, it's a description that's been used by Sinn Féin itself, particularly by Eoin O'Brien, who has described their approach as left populism. Now, I suppose there's two parts to that, but I can't see Sinn Féin before the next election, for example, U-turning on its commitment not to continue with carbon tax increases. And because of that, Sinn Féin will make it difficult for the government, and they will make it more difficult for the government to bring in the implementation of the climate action measures that we referred to earlier. Because with Sinn Féin campaigning, say on a carbon tax, that makes it harder for government backbenchers, particularly from rural constituencies. Look a little bit further forward then and consider the prospects for government of Sinn Féin, or how would Sinn Féin behave in government if it was, say, leading the next government. Well, just like the current government, that depends on the construction and constitution of that government. Who else is in government with them? Are the Green Party in government with them? In which case it will be, just as it was for the Greens on deciding to enter this government, a strong climate action platform being part of that programme for government. And as far as I see it, not to digress too much, there's two paths to government for Sinn Féin after the next election. One is potentially at the head of a left-wing coalition, which would include the Greens. The other is with Fianna Fáil. I think one of those governments would probably have a strong environmental and climate action component to its programme for government. The other wouldn't.
Thanks, Pat. Very succinctly put. I've lost track of my questions again. Sorry, 1 second. Yeah, so there's a question about the transport. How do we decarbonize the transport sector when we're still prioritizing the automobile, and EV cars are expensive, etc. I'm hoping the panel can, and indeed the audience, can see those questions. Hannah or Cara, do either of you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'll come in quickly. I'm sure Hannah has other ideas to contribute to this, but I think one of the problems, one of the mistakes we're making is at this stage, if you're privileged enough to be able to afford to buy a new car and you're not buying an electric car, there should be a sin tax for anyone buying a brand new petrol or diesel vehicle. I completely understand not everyone is able to buy a new car, but those people who shouldn't be buying petrol or diesel at this stage. So I think that's an obvious thing. I've tried to bring this to the attention of various ministers, and I've been dismissed at every point, probably because of the car lobby and various other reasons. But I think that would be an obvious thing. I'm sure Hannah has other suggestions.
I think that's exactly the right thing to focus on, because first of all, around half of new car sales now are SUVs, which are very carbon intensive. The average carbon intensity of new cars is actually growing after leveling off and falling for some years. And I think as a society, hopefully in the next year or two, there will be a concept of the fact that we have a shared limited carbon budget, and anyone bringing new infrastructure, paying to bring new equipment or whatever, either a factory or oil boiler or something that uses a huge amount of emissions like an SUV, is eating up our common carbon budget. They're unfairly taking that. And so the only way that we can have a sort of a good, affordable secondhand EV market in a couple of years is if new cars now are electrified as quickly as possible, The time for plug-in hybrids is sort of over as climate mitigation tools. They were useful 10 years ago, but new electric cars right now are excellent. Of course, and I'm sure a lot of you will agree, we need to remove cars as much as possible from towns and cities, and that also includes making towns and cities vibrant, attractive, affordable places to live. Someone in the comments asked what about derelict houses. And that is a huge win-win for both kind of reducing embodied carbon from new builds, restoring town centres, and making active and sustainable travel possible. One of I was on Daniel Murray's 5 Degrees of Change podcast a few weeks ago, and one of my sort of favorite ones was basically making policy actions was to set a target that all schools, universities, creches and so on have dedicated safe cycling and walking infrastructure within, let's say, a 2-kilometer radius on all streets. That would bring big win-wins because everybody else would come along. You'd create kind of lifelong cyclists and so on. Everybody else, we need to improve the bus provision. But those are some ideas from transport.
I'm going to bring Cara in on transport now, but Hannah, do you have it on the vacant sites, or do you have a preferred policy lever to help achieve that? Because it's definitely, the piecemeal taxation approach that has been half-heartedly and belatedly implemented so far by the government has made little impact on vacant sites, which you think they'd want to do anyway, given the housing crisis. Do you have a preferred lever?
No, I haven't thought about it enough in terms of how to implement that, but it's definitely one to watch.
I know this isn't quite the same as the above the shop question, or dimension to that question that Tina Roach's question in the chat, but I know that the environmental pillar of national environmental NGOs for almost close to 15 years has been advocating for a site value tax to replace the local property tax. And indeed, quite a number of years ago now, IBEC came to the same conclusion, arguing that it should also replace the, I think, the commercial rates. But that, the government hasn't moved on a big tax reform like that. It's kicked into touch in the Taxation Commission, and meantime the new tax on vacant sites, I think it's 2 or 3 years, Pat, before they even plan to bring it in. So it's very slow. But Cara, I want to bring you in, Cara, on both the transport and the question in the Q&A about renters and the fact that there's no incentive for landlords to do retrofitting, and no mechanisms to ensure that they move forward with it. And often, obviously, renters are living in leaky homes. Many of them are younger. They may well be fans of climate action, but they have no control over that. And how do what levers do we have to make that change either?
Thanks. So just for the transport question, I think Hannah actually touched on it in her presentation, but active transport to schools, like focusing on schools first and making safe active transport, that would probably be one of the kind of the biggest levers, because you're not only creating an infrastructure that is basically a hub within communities, but you're also creating a learned, I suppose, behavior for kids, I suppose. So that would be kind of one of the things that I would think would be the biggest. For the other tricky question of the leaky houses, yeah, rental houses, I think, are some of the most I suppose poor quality in terms of the housing stock in Ireland. They have consistently the worst BRs because they tend to be the especially the older ones. At the minute, Megan is right. There's no, it is a split incentive for retrofitting houses or rental housing. So you have the big upfront cost, and you have no, I suppose, lower bills to compensate. But there is some, like you still can get some like grants and stuff in terms if you are a landlord, but that is doing work on a house is one of the things that allows you to increase the rent past the cap that you're allowed. If you the new Housing for All policy does kind of touch on this a bit, in that there is a new mandatory minimum BER for rental accommodation. It's one of the actions that's mentioned, but there's not a lot of detail around it. So that is something that will need to be, I suppose, followed up on after now that it is published and looked at. And it doesn't focus too much on. So the stick would be that it is mandatory, but there's not that much, I suppose, detail about how it will be implemented or when it'll be done by. I think it's a couple of years. But yeah, I think it is. It is one of those sticky questions, in that when we were looking at it, as JCFJ was looking at it, that was one of the kind of issues that was. It actually needs to be more work done on it, because there isn't any protection for tenants there. And if you make it a mandatory minimum BER, it actually might take some of the housing stock off the market, and then it'll be put into the vacant. So that is one of the things that hasn't been, I suppose, sorted yet. So that is a very unsatisfactory answer, but yeah, it is a tricky one.
Promise we would solve answer all of the questions that were asked tonight, or the problems that, but it's good. It's an issue that hasn't been focused on enough, I think, given the intersection of climate crisis and the housing crisis, or given how big both those crises are. The rental sector is one where they really do intersect, and it's good to spotlight it at least. We're coming towards the end, but we've saved the easiest question for last. We've tried to answer all questions. There's one I'll come back to that have had 8 thumbs ups or more, but the one that we haven't that has 8 thumbs up is, how do we organize a just transition for farming? Any takers? And there's a political dimension to this too, but Cara or Hannah, do you want to start with that? Hannah, you have your hand up, go for it.
Sure. I would like to point that I think Climate Action Plan in action number 385 or something is for next year to have a just transition plan for agriculture, which is under the land use chapter, interestingly. But I think it's really important, because what is kind of neglected from a lot of these discussions is that, you know, land is a really finite resource. What we have, we can have infinite theoretical money and whatever, but we have finite land and finite time, and land will be the kind of, I think, a key thing going forward to 2050. Land is needed to produce food, to create a carbon sink, and to support nature, and biodiversity, and those things. And also, land will be an opportunity to create fuels if we choose to go down the bioenergy route. So we'll have to negotiate the use of land for all those things, going towards carbon neutrality in 2050. That also creates a big opportunity for landowners if they want to be part of the kind of low carbon transition. You know, our agriculture system at the moment is highly dependent on kind of 2 key kind of global commodity products, most of which go to developed countries who don't need more beef and dairy. We're also more at risk of climate change vulnerability if grasslands become overheated. So I think highlighting those opportunities for the transition from intensive beef and dairy production, and also the threats of climate change, will be very important.
Thanks, Cara.
Yeah, it's a topic that I've been working on a lot this week, and I found the French context so interesting, because it's actually their dairy and beef sectors in agriculture that are leading the kind of low carbon transition in agriculture, because dairy farmers in France make very little money, whereas in Ireland it's the opposite scenario. So they see climate action as an opportunity for them to increase their income. And I wrote a lot in my blog about the kind of measures that they're taking to move to a low carbon system. But one of the debates that came up was this idea that we need to decide which approach we're taking. Is it land sparing, which is what we've been doing a lot of in the common agricultural policy, setting aside land for nature, you know, to kind of allow it to sequester carbon more, or is it land sharing? Is it more trying to get farmers to do more low carbon practices while also producing food? And some people that I talked to in France were saying we need to, you know, in Europe in particular, where land is at a premium and they don't have a lot of land to spare, they need to look more toward land sharing and kind of low carbon farming practices. Maybe in Ireland we have a different situation. Maybe we have an opportunity to do more land sparing. And I think the thing that has really come as a surprise to the farming community recently, and thanks to to the analysis of the Carbon Budget Committee, that actually land in Ireland is currently a source of carbon and will continue to be a source of carbon as we, harvest the trees that we've planted right now, because we're not replacing those trees fast enough, and our management practices in farms are actually causing a release of carbon instead of absorbing carbon. So we have a real problem here in Ireland to get our beautiful organic peaty soils that should be carbon sinks and turn them into carbon sinks instead of sources.
I'm conscious of time, and we really should finish now in a second. But I want to ask you, Pat, one more question, which maybe is unfair and maybe you can't answer, but I will ask it anyway. As someone who's felt a lot of the time over many years that that as a campaigner you're screaming into the void about climate for a long time, it's been amazing how much focus has been on it in the last 2 years or more, as with the process that began with the Citizens' Assembly, as was the case with well, not began in those cases, but as was the case to some degree with marriage and abortion. And despite the pandemic, climate has been a significant policy issue on the landscape this year, and obviously a COP in our neighbouring state helped that, but internationally that was true as well. But in an Irish context, how likely is that? How likely or how possible is it to sustain that if we eventually get to a, if not quite post-pandemic, but at least living with COVID scenario next year? Surely housing, the economy and jobs, if there's a jobs cliff in March or April, the healthcare system more generally will have to come back and dominate the agenda. How, as civil society campaigners interested in climate, how do we keep climate on the agenda? Is it just banging the drum? Is it trying to find those intersections with, as we've mentioned a bit tonight? And again, as I say, it's not for you to solve our strategy for next year, but what's your thoughts on how does this stay? Is it as simple as the Green Party hanging together, or what does civil society do to keep this issue live and relevant and resonant in 2022?
That's part of it, Green Party hanging together. Let me go back to the previous question just very briefly, though. The question was, I think, how do you get farmers on board to for climate action measures? I think there's a really simple answer to that. Show them how they can make money out of it. Naib Evan was asked, how did he get the doctors in the UK to agree to the construction of the National Health Service? He said, I stuffed their mouths with gold. So I suspect something like that might have to be accomplished with farmers if they are going to come on board to climate action measures. So to go back to your question, Oisín, I think it is true that in a post-pandemic political discourse, which we're not yet at, although I thought we were returning to it after the summer, and there were some indications that we were, when you saw things like the kind of quotidian concerns of politics, the housing crisis, the health service, public services, cost of living, those sort of things muscling back into the political debate, which had previously, for the previous year or more, been dominated entirely by COVID. Now COVID is pushing them out a little bit, but I think that would be temporary. So I think next year you revert again to not quite politics as it was before, but a more normal politics in which all these issues are jostling for attention in the public square and for government time, money, and attention. But I think that climate action has sort of, I think it has breached the levee in the sense that it is now, by virtue of the scale of climate crisis, the coverage that it gets, the public awareness of it. Look back at our poll today and you look at those huge numbers, majority of people saying that it should be the government's first priority, not just one of a number of priorities, but its first priority. So I think that climate issues have been promoted really to the premiership of public policy issues, where they are not the only one, but they're one among several. How do you keep public attention focused on it? Well, if you believe that those issues are the most important thing for a government to be dealing with, you do your best to keep the Green Party in government, but you also make the case, I suppose, in the media, in public square, in on the streets if it comes to that, for the necessity for climate for climate action measures. And you know, you've got a lot of resources in terms of public interest, particularly amongst young people, a lot of energy that can be tapped into there. So I think that climate issues are now part of the political mainstream and will remain so. The extent to which they are right at the very top of the government's agenda, I think, depends on some of the things we've already spoken about. But I don't see us going back to a situation, not just because of the laws that have been enacted and the international agreements into which the government has entered, but also because of those. I think that they will remain a central part of our political discourse for the foreseeable future.
Thanks, Pat. We could obviously, with 46 questions, I think we got through about 12 of them. We could be here all evening very, very fruitfully, but it has been a long evening and a long year. I asked my colleagues this morning how many public events online had we organized, either as Stop Climate Chaos or as the One Future Network or as Friends of the Earth. And the answer I got by about, they were still counting at 5 o'clock. It was somewhere between 70 and 80 online events. Which compared to pre-COVID times when you had to book a hotel room is like exponential growth, both in number of events and number of attendees. And it's great that we've had over 150 people here this evening for this, our final public event of the year. And so thank you all for coming, and thank you so much to the panelists. I think you gave us a lot of food for thought, and kind of we have our work cut out for us, but in a good way for the year ahead. We know I have a better understanding anyway of the issues and the challenges and the opportunities and the connections between the strands of this work for the year ahead. And I think it was Ithel asked this question about where if you're not a farmer or a trucker, where do you go? And the answer is one of the organizations as part of the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition, or the many grassroots organizations who are active on climate around the country on specific issues like fracking or oil and gas, are the One Future network of local climate campaign groups. Or indeed Friends of the Earth, or any of the members of the Stop Climate Chaos. So you join a public interest organization that is fighting to keep this on the agenda, and we press all political parties to do everything that's required to do our fair share. And we'll be back in the new year, and you'll be glad to know some of you who are connected to the Stop Climate Chaos or One Future networks know that we had staff turnover during the year. We'll be back to full capacity in January, so we'll be able to give more week-to-week accompaniment of both the coalition and the local network of One Future groups. So we look forward to that. In the meantime, I hope you have a peaceful, restful, and safe and joyful season. And we'll see you all in the new year. And thank you all very much indeed for being with us this evening.